that, as much as when Jeff Sessions came here, it was a conflict with our showing up at Senator Merkley's office. And it feels really good to yell at a building where Jeff Sessions might hear you. And I understand the impulse and the kind of gratification that comes out of that. And meeting with your senator is not sexy. It's not this daily grind of daily actions and calling and whatever. It's not that big solidarity thing. But for me, it just seems so much more effective. And if you have organizing energy to spend, it feels that seems like a more valuable place to put it. But I understand that people see value in different things.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive, actually. I think the value of protest, I went to the Jeff Sessions protest, and the value of it, I think it's multifold. I think it's important, those things make the news and then they get talked about, and people see, oh, there's this bad guy doing bad things, and people aren't complacent about it. And I think that's really important. And I think it's also important that the people we're protesting against see that we're not a complacent populace. That was what happened in the 2000 election. People were complacent. And I think it's important to keep seeing that people are not complacent. And if you fire Mueller, there's going to be hell to pay and people are going to take to the streets. And it can seem oh, what's the good of this? People go out there and they carry signs and then they go home and nothing happens. But I think, the Women's March is a good example. They've set up an entire organization, the Women's March organizers. And Megan, you went to the Women's March convention in October. And so I think that they've built a groundwork and a whole organization and a structure that can and is affecting change. So I think these things all go hand in hand. I think they're all important parts of the puzzle of, representative democracy.
That's a good point. And I changed my mind.
And I do think the Women's March had a real effect on Trump's poll numbers, being the poll head that I am. I think that it sort of set the tone for his low polling numbers. I think you look at the polling and that's where it really sort of, in those days afterwards, sort of opposition to Trump coalesced around the Women's March and turned into sort of low polling numbers. And I think that those numbers really have had a real political impact. Trump's average approval rating in Gallup for 2017 was 38%, and that's terrible. And his terrible polling numbers have given some Republicans some cover to, in some limited cases, oppose the party's attempts to do things like repeal the ACA. And so those poll numbers do have a real political impact. And I think the Women's March sort of galvanized people against Trump and sort of helped those numbers go down.
What about the protests at the airports, especially when the first travel ban was announced? Or Muslim ban, or whatever they called it at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that was also really effective. I think that really alarmed a lot of people. And I think, for one thing, it was really great to see that people could just gather, spontaneously with no planning, no permitting, just show up and stand for something. And I think that was really important. And I think it really freaked the government out when they saw that. And I think all the AGs, the Democratic attorneys general who came out and filed, against the ban, I think it all worked together to show that there really was overwhelming public sentiment about this issue.
Yeah, I think so too. And one thing I know we saw at the Chicago airports, I assume this was happening everywhere, was protesters showing up and at the same time lawyers showing up. Just
yes, exactly.
Out of the blue, unpaid volunteers saying, I have legal expertise. I'm going to come and help anyone who needs help. And I think that was a really good thing to see, people starting to recognize oh, maybe I don't have power in this place, but I have, some sort of expertise. I have some sort of talent. I have something I can lend. I think that's the kind of thing. Obviously, anyone with legal training is sort of always going to be in demand in these sorts of things. But, I think people with artistic talent, people with all sorts of different talent.
You ran the Facebook page.
Yes, if you happen to know social media stuff. Yeah. And, I think that's really good for people to recognize. I've had women that I have asked to either write for our website or come on the podcast, and I've said, I'm really impressed by what you know about this subject. And so frequently they're like, oh, well, I'm not really an expert, I'm not sure. Sometimes I can still strong arm them into coming on, but I think it's really good for people to start to recognize, especially women, especially in our society, to start to recognize what they do have to offer. And I think, dealing with the political situation we have right now involves all of us. We all have to be able to give what we have. And so something like lawyers spontaneously realizing I have skills and I've got time right now, I can go for a couple hours and help people, that's a really powerful thing.
Yeah,
I think like that was really helpful in kind of seeing the networking that came out of that and the Women's March. I think people recognized that they were allies and that those allies were willing to help them. And we kind of got into this circle, I guess, like of people who have skills, who are willing to offer skills, and it's not some sort of like scam. Like it's just like a different feeling where people are just so much more likely to help each other. And we kind of got to see who those people were and offer stuff that we had. And those are connections that have continued, especially like even in our group in Indivisible Oregon, have continued to happen. People are just very willing to help you if you have the same goal.
Yeah, I mean, I think for better or for worse, one of the big takeaways from the 2016 election was seeing such an unqualified person
right.
rise to the highest level of power made us all realize, like, you know what, I actually am qualified to do X, Y, Z. I actually do have some skills, and
more than that guy. And he's president.
Unfortunately, the bar is so low now, but I think that really woke a lot of people up.
Mm-hmm. So before we move on from protests and sort of the highlights of 2017, I think we should also talk about the NFL protest and Colin Kaepernick, and especially look at that in the light of how Trump reacted and how a lot of people on the right reacted to those protests. I'm visiting my parents in Ohio right now, so that's where I'm recording from, and there was a sort of hubbub here in this small town in Ohio because a pizza place had put on their marquee outside their store something about, we always stand for the flag or something like that. It was like a pizza place. It had nothing, like they're not part of the NFL. They're not a political organization.
Do you do that when you put the pizza in the oven or when you take it out? What's the appropriate time?
Every morning?
And so, it's
weird.
It's such a bizarre, like all the talking points and everything that were around it and the sides that people were taking that didn't even seem like they made sense, and Pence showing up at an NFL game just to stand.
But not really.
But not really.
That he left, right?
Right. Yeah.
He showed up just so he could walk out.
Right.
Yeah. He charged the government like $14,000 for him to go and show up for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
It was bizarre. I think there's layers to this bizarreness.
Yeah. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah. I mean, is this kind of protesting effective? Is it the right thing for Colin Kaepernick to be doing? Are the arguments that he's at work and he shouldn't be doing this sort of thing while he's at work? But where do we feel about all of this?
Oh, I'm behind him 1,000%.
Yeah, 1,000%.
Totally.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's his right to speak his mind. It's his First Amendment right. And I think the issue of police killing of unarmed Black people is something that needs attention brought to it. And I think, a lot of people forgot that was the whole purpose of his protest.
Right.
So, and I think that the way the NFL responded by blackballing him is shameful. I think he got a lot of attention on the issue, and that was his goal.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I feel like if you are someone in a position of privilege, and as a Black man playing for the NFL, he's in a position of privilege, to turn in that privilege. That's kind of been the theme for me all year, is turning in some of that and using a platform you have, that it's not easy. It may have consequences for you, but it's an important thing to do. And whether or not he's working or, whatever, the idea that you would play the Star Spangled Banner and you would be forced to that creeps me out anyway. I didn't like it in elementary school. I don't do it anywhere else. It's just a super creepy thing. If you have a platform and you're not, the worst thing that could happen is that he'd be fired, and he was going to be fine even if he were fired. And I think it's going to take a lot of people doing that and stepping out on a limb when they can to move the needle.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought up the whole thing about the anthem, because I personally have an issue with all the jingoism in American culture and especially sporting events. Jingoism is false patriotism.
Okay.
And even as a little kid, I remember at some point somebody telling me, you don't have to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance in school. And I stopped. And I haven't done it since. I didn't stand during the Obama administration, and I sure as shit don't stand now, because I don't believe, first of all, in pledging allegiance to ideals that are not being upheld.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't believe in blind obedience to any kind of, top-down ideals. That being said, sometimes we go to NBA games here, and it's not just the national anthem. It's throughout the entire game. They salute veterans during halftime, and they do this whole ridiculous display with the flag, and all the screens in the stadium, in the arena have, this bullshit pro-military propaganda. And it's like, it's just a basketball game. Can we just watch some people play ball? Like, why does it have to be, and it's cloaked in the flag and this like fetishization of the military, which then leads to everybody thinking like, Kelly and McMaster and all those guys are going to save us from Trump. Like, it's a much bigger issue that really gets under my skin. I know I'm totally going off topic here, but so for somebody like Colin Kaepernick or other NFL players to use that as their moment and like Megan said, use their privilege to draw attention to a very unjust system and an unjust situation. And then for like the reason that the fact that it gets under people's skin so much is it goes back to why do we fetishize the military so much in this country, and like you can never, ever criticize anything the U.S. military is doing without being completely
a traitor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like there's just no questioning of it.
I also don't do the Pledge of Allegiance. And what was interesting for me in discussions with people about the NFL protests was talking about my reasons for not standing for the pledge. My reasons are actually religious. Mm-hmm. I don't pledge my allegiance to any earthly person or government or anything like that. I'm allegiant only to God. And so it was pretty fun to talk to conservatives about it who would say, oh, you have to stand for the flag just like you stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And I would say, I don't stand for the Pledge of Allegiance and I don't say it. And they would say, oh, you liberal, blah, blah, blah. And I'd say, actually, it's because I'm a Christian. It's because of my religious beliefs. And that's how he puts them in a fun bind. Because
that's fun.
I bet.
Yeah, they're all like, oh, well, religious freedom. But patriotism, but religious freedom. It's fun to watch their heads spin.
Yeah, I thought of that point when we were watching the 10 Commandments with my 6-year-old because he likes weird stuff like that. There's the scene where Charlton Heston as Moses comes down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments on the 2 tablets, and he's talking about false images and stuff, and I was like, oh right, so why are we worshiping a flag? I'm pretty sure all these people who are claiming to be Christian, and that's all wrapped up with their patriotism, that doesn't make any sense.
No, but they're also the ones claiming that Trump is a man of God. So.
Right.
And Roy Moore.
And Roy Moore, right. But Trump especially.
Yes.
What the hell?
Roy Moore, for the record, I just looked, has not conceded.
Of course not.
God still hasn't told him to concede.
Yes.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of what we're terming the good. We got a lot of bad and snark in with the good, but that's okay. So let's talk about who our heroes of 2017 were. What do we think, guys? Sally Yates is one of the obvious ones.
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah. I hope she runs for something. You guys think she's going to run?
I hope so. She's the hero we need, not the one we deserve.
There's a change.org petition trying to get her to run for Senate in Georgia.
She would be amazing. I would love that.
Yeah.
I think she just wrote an article that was, of course, incredibly inspiring. USA Today, I believe.
Yes.
And we can put it in the show notes. It's spot on. I just think that she's her integrity, she's exactly the kind of person I think we need.
Yeah, I agree.
I just want to shout out my personal hero, Tim Ryan, Congressman Tim Ryan from Ohio, from the Youngstown area, who went viral. He had a big speech on the floor of the House against the tax bill where he talked very impassioned about the negative effects that the tax bill is going to have on his constituents who are mostly working class here in Youngstown. He's awesome. He took this seat over from Jim Traficant, who I think I've talked about him on the podcast before, is sort of the original Trump. If you don't know about him, look him up. He was a congressman until the mid-2000s when he was expelled from the House. He became the second person since the Civil War to be expelled from the House of Representatives. Wow. He was convicted on 9 counts of racketeering and bribery, some other things, I think. He served 9 years in jail. And so Tim Ryan took over the seat from him. He had been in it forever. So he knows how to deal with Trump types. And I think he should run for senator in Ohio. And I think eventually he should